Thank you for joining us, everyone. Welcome to Sutton House. I'd just like to introduce our next speaker, who's Lionel Lee.
Don't clap till you've heard it. I want to congratulate you all for coming on such a lovely day and for choosing this talk. It's very wise to see. Can I just begin by saying that most people don't know what SOE was. I'm going to presume that a lot of you do. Special Operations Executive was a group of secret agents, and when in the dark days of the war in 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister. Some of you were alive at the time, not me. And one of the first decrees he made was to set up a secret organisation that could hit back at the Nazis, to set Europe ablaze. That was his quote, to set Europe ablaze. So SOE were not spies. A spy is like Fielding McLean. They embed themselves in a nation, or they come from abroad, and they live and work as civilians, and nobody knows who they are and so on. They usually don't kill people, and they usually don't carry out espionage, they carry information. SOE agents were military. They were all commissioned officers. They volunteered mostly from the armed forces, but some came from civilian society as well. It depended on the skills that they had and what SOE wanted from them. As a historian of the Jewish community, I've written quite a bit about the contribution of the Jewish community in the two world wars to defence of the realm. And this book, the first edition, has a yellow cover, and the library, Hackney Libraries, do have a couple of them. This is the second edition in blue. This contains a lot of material on that subject, and included is quite a lot of material on Jewish SOE agents. It's by a guy called Martin Sugarman. I don't know who the hell he is, but I gather he's quite a nice chap. Okay, so let's begin with talking about Lionel. He was born in Hackney on the 24th of June 1917, the son of Abraham and Esther Levy. And her maiden name, his mother's maiden name, was Trivich. They lived, and he was born at 2 Fremont Street, which is just between King Edward Road and Victoria Park Road, so he's very local. He had an older sister, Pearl, and an older brother, Asher, who also had a distinguished war career. And family records show that Asher was born in Plymouth, so the family must have been there for some while before Lionel was born. And they were tailors, the family were tailors. So from a typical kind of working class Jewish background. Sometime in the 20s and 30s, the family changed their name from Levy, a very Jewish name, to Lee, and Abraham became Alfred. But certainly Lionel Lee was born in Hackney, went to school in Hackney, we think. I haven't been able to do as much research as I'd like on his background, but there is very little known about him. And I'd also like to acknowledge, because this is being filmed, that my good friend Paul McHugh, who runs the Secret War Society, which I urge you all to join if you're interested in this subject, was of enormous assistance in helping me put this together. We also know from the 1940 National Register, which was in place of the census because of the war, that Lionel lived at 10 Nightingale Road, which is by the Hebrews Road roundabout. The house doesn't exist anymore because the Nightingale estate is built on it. So we know he lived there, and he was married to Lillian, whose maiden name was Raymond, and later they had a child. But we've not been able to trace any of the family. Not yet. Now, again, I don't know if you know the SOE file. SOE was a very secret organisation. Nobody knew about it during the war, and for about 30 years after the war, a bit like Bletchley Park, if you know about the famous code-breaking building at Bletchley Park. And people signed the Official Secrets Act when they joined SOE, and many people kept their mouths quiet about where they were and what they did. Sturm, as they say in Yiddish, in Hackney. No one spoke about it, and there is even evidence of husbands and wives meeting after a war and not telling each other where they worked during the war till about they'd been married about 40 years. That's keeping a secret. Particularly with Bletchley, but also with SOE. Their personal files were kept in the Foreign Office. They were not given to the National Archives because they contain information which may have been used to our enemies, inverted commas, in the Cold War. So a lot of Bletchley Park stuff and SOE stuff was kept under wraps and didn't get to the National Archives for several decades. So we know from his personal file, his PF, that he underwent training in the army. He was in the Royal Armoured Corps, and he became an officer. He was commissioned. It's pretty clear that he was a language teacher, probably French, because that's why he was sent to France and spoke very good French, and also had a job in the Field Security Police. That's another branch of the military police. Field Security Police were often in the front line looking after German prisoners or enemy prisoners. And so he already had a bit of a background in secret work, so he was deemed quite appropriate. And if there's time at the end for questions, and there will be, because this meeting, there's no other meeting in this room afterwards, so if you want to go on and ask some questions, you can. I can tell you a little bit about how he probably was recruited. SOE was divided into country sections, and he was taken into F section, French section. And this is because even at the beginning of the war, the Allies knew that when the liberation of Europe came, it was probably France that we were going to invade. So F section was probably the most important branch of SOE. He was sent for preliminary training to STS, Special Training School 5, which is Wamborough Manor near Guildford. And that's where he would have been given all the preliminary tests which would have determined what they wanted to use him as. He later did parachute training at STS 51, which is Ringway, which is now Manchester Airport. That's where all the SOE agents and also some paratroops did their training. His successful training meant that he was promoted captain from lieutenant in November 1942, and he was selected to become a radio operator. Now, you could do various things in SOE, but being a radio operator was the most dangerous because you had to find a safe house, operate your radio. The Germans could triangulate and find where you were broadcasting from, and it's reckoned that if you survived for 3 months, you were doing well. But he wasn't deterred. Most of the Jewish agents were very highly motivated because they wanted to get back and fight the Nazis. And so he was happy to be a radio operator. And he was sent to Fame Park in Oxfordshire in January 1943 to train as such. SOE commandeered a large number of stately homes and big houses in the countryside all over Britain, from Scotland down to the south coast. They were cordoned off, heavily guarded by the Home Guard, and no one was allowed in and out. Very secret, which is why nobody knew about what was going on in these places. In his report, it says, the security of this student is good. He has a good appreciation of the importance which security plays or will play in his future life. He's a good mixer, has the ability to remain inconspicuous, very important for an agent. In the vicinity of the school, he is quiet, sometimes reserved, and careful in what he says. So he was then sent, after training, to a place in Algiers called the Club d'Epine, codename Massingham, where he was going to be inserted into enemy territory from there. And he was given the code name René. This was his code name as an agent, but his new identity named him as, I'll make sure I read the right name, René Lionel Giraud. Agents were always given a middle name which was one of their real names, because psychologists said this helped them to remember their secret identity if they were interrogated. He also had the field name Mechanic. These were all used in his radio messages so that he could identify himself when messages were being sent to London. So, Lee was taken by His Majesty's submarine Trident, captained by Lieutenant Newstead, to Corsica, to a place called Pointe du Trave on the River Travo. Corsica was occupied by Italian, Nazi and Vichy French troops, including the milice, and you'll excuse my French, the Vichy milice were real bastards. They were appallingly anti-Semitic and very cruel. Even German soldiers were astonished at how cruel they were. So Corsica was an important place. It was in the Mediterranean, very important for British troop ships going to the Middle East and to the Far East through the canal, Suez Canal, and it was deemed important that they had resistance groups on the island. So Lionel was sent there with other agents who were French, themselves French, to assist him. And his main job was to unite the resistance groups on the island, because other people again don't know really what some of these agents were up against. It wasn't simply a question of going, seeing what was going on, radioing it back to Britain. Very often the resistance groups were rivals. There were Gaullist groups who supported de Gaulle, there were communist groups, there were in France itself Catholic resistance groups. In southwest France there were whole resistance groups made up only of Jews who were hiding in the forests and the mountains. And there was even an Armenian French resistance group. So it was by no means a joint effort. They did argue, and also many of the resistance fighters in France were ex-army, some of them quite high-ranking, and they vied for control of the resistance group. There were lots of arguments, there were fights, even shootouts sometimes. So an agent like Lionel Lee had to be very diplomatic as well. So when he landed, or when the submarine entered the estuary, with him went special boat service, SBS, folding canoes, kayaks. If you see the film Cockleshell Heroes, you'll know what a fold boat is. And with them they took boats filled from the submarine with grenades, ammunition, weapons, money for the resistance, because they had to buy food and clothes. Boots were very important, uniforms, so they could appear to be a military unit. All the SOE agents were given officer rank, by the way, so that if they were captured, it would give them a measure of protection from torture or even murder. But in fact, it didn't work. But they were all officers. So they were successfully landed. There was a big welcome party from the local resistance, and he was whisked off, Lionel was whisked off to a safe house, and all the supplies were hidden in the forest and retrieved the next day. That was the usual deal. The usual deal was to get away from the landing point as quickly as possible in case the Germans or the Italians had spotted them. They went to a town called Bastia, and that's where the safe house was, but Lionel thought this was too big a place, and so they went to a village, strangely enough, confusingly enough, called Corsica. So they're in the village of Corsica, in Corsica. And there they found a safe house. A woman acted as his landlady for Lionel. She was not told very much, she didn't ask too many questions, she was known to be sympathetic, and that was good enough for resistance. And here he stayed for 2.5 months, and he was transmitting messages back to London about the disposition of troops, enemy troops all over the island, where he could find out the information from the resistance workers who worked for him and were coming to and fro, giving him messages. In the first month, he had to also identify dropping zones, DZs. This was really important because he had to find isolated places, usually on plateaus, where an aircraft, Allied aircraft, could land, insert agents, insert supplies, or if they were parachuting containers, it had to be a space surrounded by trees where the local resistance would come out and pick the stuff up and whisk it off before any enemy who might have seen them got there. These aircraft, by the way, that did this were a special squadron for RAF called 161 Squadron. known as the Moonlight Squadron. These were really brave guys who went in very light aircraft with no arms to make the aircraft light so they could land easily, take off easily, and they all worked out of Tempsford Aerodrome, which is near Bedford. And if you go there today, there is, the aerodrome has been closed and there's a little factory or something there, but there is a barn which is like a giant memorial, and it's full of memorabilia of the agents who left from there, and many of whom, of course, have never made it home. An aircraft from 161 Squadron could take off and disappear, never be seen again. They could crash into sea, they could be shot down into lakes and marshes, and many of the men who were lost in the RAF squadron, including some Jewish guys, one of whom I interviewed, Derek Gibbons, who won the Distinguished Flying Cross for being in the squadron. Many of them are on the memorials for the missing at Runnymede to the RAF, because nobody knows where their remains are. So he identified all these dropping zones and successfully trained the resistance to know what to do, how to collect them, and hide them in various places that had already been marked out for that purpose. Someone in Corsica village had a bit of a big mouth. There were lots of traitors anyway that infiltrated SOE resistance groups, and they said that there was activity, enemy activity in the village. So one night there was a raid in the village, and Italian fascist forces searched all the houses in the village, but they didn't search the house that Lionel was in. And he considered himself so lucky that that night he left and went to hide in the mountains with his colleagues. The next day, he knew they would be back, and the next day, because they hadn't found anything, they did indeed come back. They arrested the landlady, but she got away with saying, I don't know who the hell he was just a guy paying my rent. And she managed to talk herself out of the situation. But he had many close calls like that, and when I eventually get this published, you'll be able to read the fine detail. So he found a new location and carried on the work which he was found to do, sending messages, receiving supplies, inventory sets. When the Italian armistice was announced on the 8th of September 1943, Lee continued to work for the resistance, and because the commander of the resistance group, the military commander, a guy called Colonna de Istra, he had to go to the French mainland to consult with his French resistance leaders. He was a Gaullist. Lionel was left in charge of 12,000 fighting men and women. Now that's a huge number. I mean, that's well above his rank and pay level as a captain. But he did a splendid work, apparently. They hounded the Germans while they were retreating, because Italy had surrendered. And when the Germans finally left, on September the 11th, they received orders from Algiers, which had been his base. By the way, they went in from Algiers because that was safer to go in a submarine than fly over France, which was fully occupied still by the German forces. So Algiers ordered him to be able to get to Ajaccio, the capital town of Corsica, meet up with French troops who were taking over the occupation of the island, French liberation, Free French, and he was allowed to go home. Now, we're not sure how he got home, but the usual route was to get them to Spain and then to Gibraltar, and from Gibraltar they would be flown on a neutral airline, Swedish, Swiss, Portuguese, Spanish, and get back to Britain. Sometimes they were picked up by submarine, but Lionel, it's thought, probably flew back. So he arrived in the UK in 1943. All the fighting in Corsica had ended. He was debriefed, and this is very important, in December 1943, because all the records of the National Archives, they contain his attestation form when he joined. They contain all the messages and information he sent, usually Prayseed, but it was there, and also his debriefing. He was closely questioned about what it was like to do this and this. Did he have tips for agents who were going to follow him in other theatres of the war? And the debriefing was the most crucial part of his homecoming before he could go and see his family. You can see from his record that he sent 70 messages back to the UK and received 60. This is a measure of the work he was doing. That's a very high number, which means he was occupied all the time. So it's no wonder that when he got home, he was mentally and physically exhausted. Also, when he was going from safe house to safe house, he would have been using a push bike and doing hundreds of kilometres a week and going from place to place, also meeting up with resistance groups who were hiding in the mountains and in other secret places. And in recognition of this achievement, he was awarded what was said to be a justly deserved military cross. Second only to the VC, and a high award indeed, and it was gazetted on the 9th of December in the London Gazette in 1943. He then made a bit of a mistake. SOE made a mistake too. He volunteered for a second mission. Now this is very foolhardy, because no matter what he thought, the Gestapo, the forces in Corsica, they would have known about him. They would have probably known his name, even though he was no longer on the island. And that information would be in the hands of the German intelligence, whether it was the army intelligence or the Gestapo, and he would have been well known to the enemy forces, as would some of the leaders of the resistance who were French. Anyway, he volunteered, and so he was sent to Special Training School 40, Halbury Hall, which is in Waterend in Bedfordshire, not far from Chelmsford, from the aerodrome, in January 44, and it was there he learnt how to operate what was called an S-phone. This was a small radio, much smaller than the big suitcase thing they had to carry, so it was a huge improvement, but it required technical skill and how to repair if it broke. So he did the course and he qualified, and it says in his report, qualified on the S-phone, has worked hard and done well, maintenance and operation of Eureka beacon. Eureka beacons were little devices which paratroopers took, or agents took, on the ground. An aircraft, Allied aircraft, would have a partner to it. When the aircraft flew over a dropping zone, day or night, in any weather, they would pick up the beacon signal and they would know that was the dropping zone, and they would drop their containers or exit the agents. They knew exactly where they were. They used them on D-Day and at the Battle of Arnhem considerably, but he was one of the first to use them before that. So, his second mission, he was sent to mainland France. This was with the resistance group codenamed Bricklayer. All the different French resolutes or resistance groups were given code names. This was Bricklayer. He parachuted in with French woman agent Madeleine Benaron, very famous agent if you know anything about this SOE. And sadly, waiting on the dropping zone were the Nazis. The reason? Beforehand, a previous agent had been captured and the Nazis got hold of the radio. And they practiced what was called Funkspiel, radio game. They pretended they were the agent. So they would send false messages to London, and if it wasn't picked up, this wasn't the real agent, then they would drop agents where the Nazi agent told them to, and they'd be waiting for them. Did you see the film, what's the one with Kate Blanchett? Charlotte Gray. Watch the film Charlotte Gray. It's pretty, it's very, whoever wrote the screenplay did their homework, and there are all these kinds of incidents that occurred played off in the film by Charlotte and Gammon, who plays the French agent. So they were picked up, the agents who went with him, they were very pleased, the Germans, to get hold of Madeleine Benaron because she was quite famous, and they were captured. They were in the hands of the enemy. Now, a word here I must explain to you. In London, the SOE headquarters were at Baker Street. at the head office of Marks and Spencer's. Jewish firm, very ironic and suitable. They gave the whole of the building over to SOE, they knew it was important. And the person in charge of the codes, teaching codes and how to use the radio, was a Jewish guy called Leo Marks. Leo Marks was the son of the famous antique bookseller in Charing Cross Road. You've seen the film 84 Charing Cross Road, Anthony Hopkins. He was the son of the owner of the shop. And he had learned about codes as a small boy, because his dad used to use codes in the book to tell him what price to charge the customers. If somebody looked rich, the price was high. If it was a student, somebody was poor, then he would charge the lower price. And Leo learned to read the code that his dad had made up. And this, with a little boy, typically, he became very interested in codes. He was also a maths scholar. And when he wanted to join the army, he went for an interview, because he went for a commission, Leo, because he was quite well educated. They said, oh, we've got something special for you, and they sent him to Baker Street. And he became chef de codage, the chief of codes. And he was the one who knew all the agents. He taught them how to use their radios, how to use Morse code, and he gave them all the code poem. Now, I've never understood how this worked, but every agent was given a poem to learn. They could choose one, but not a famous one, because the Nazis would find out. And he would write most of these poems. He was quite a scholar. And the most famous one that he wrote for Violet Szabo, the famous George Cross winner who was murdered by the Nazis, the film Carve Her Name with Pride. Have you seen that? What's her name? Virginia McKenna plays Violet Szabo, and Paul Schofield plays a very famous agent, Peter Churchill. And he taught them and gave them their code poems, and the most famous one, it's beautiful, it's been published in a book actually, even though it's only a few pages. The love that I have is the life that I have, and the love that I have is yours. It's beautiful. But he wrote it actually for his girlfriend, who had died in bombing. And he did marry later in life, but he gave that poem to Violet, who he was kind of possibly a bit in love with, because she was a very beautiful woman. So that was Leo Marks. He was a very important guy. But the reason I'm telling you this is that Leo Marks spotted at once that the radios were wrong. He said the agents are not putting in their deliberate mistake. So if you sent a message saying thank you at the bottom, you left out the letter N, that was a sign that you were the agent. The Germans didn't know that. They would see thank you with an N and think, well, that's okay. But Leo Marks and the others, the women, Wrens and WAFs and ATS and Fanny women who were receiving these messages in Baker Street, they knew if there was something wrong. They'd tell Leo and he'd inspect it and he would make the decision, this radio has been compromised. And he told the chief of the French section, Colonel Buckmaster, very famous guy, this radio has been compromised, and he told them that all the Dutch agents had been compromised. And they wouldn't believe him. They said he was being over-dramatic. There was the undertones of very low-level anti-Semitism here, because they thought that he was fussing, making a bit of a show. He wasn't. He was right. They were dropping Dutch agents into Holland, and they were all being captured and killed. And 20 or 30 of them were caught in that way. In fact, the Germans, when it was discovered this happened, the Germans sent the last message saying, thank you, Colonel Buckmaster, for all the agents you sent us. That was how cheeky they were. That was the Gestapo intelligence. So, the Germans were pleased to have caught Lionel and Madeleine Delaron. The resistance managed to tell London that they thought that he had been captured, so they were on the lookout for his radio being played. The only definite knowledge of his subsequent movements came in a radio message on the 27th of June, so this is just after D-Day on the 6th of June, which we're coming up to. And it said that Lee was among those in a prison at the Place États-Unis in Paris. Now this was the Gestapo headquarters, it was a torture chamber, and they knew that he'd been there, someone had seen him. This happened with a lot of agents. Witnesses could build up a picture in debriefings of what happened to X, they were taken, captured, and they were here. The families, of course, wanted to know this. In May 44, it is likely Lee, with Demerol, were known to have been in a group of agents taken by lorry into Germany to Woolwich prison camp. This was an enormous, brutal fortress place, and it was an out camp of Mauthausen, which was a death and labour camp in Austria. According to post-war British Army investigation in 48, after the war, it was believed in July orders came from Berlin to execute all the agents. How are we doing for time?
Okay.
Some people wonder why Field Marshal Jodl and Keitel were executed at Nuremberg. It's because they signed the death warrants of all British agents and commandos, the notorious Hitler commando order. And that is what got them hung. They didn't do any fighting. They were in Berlin in the bunker and running the war, but they were hung for signing the order alongside Hitler. So he was taken from Woolwich, where he was probably tortured, but we don't know, to Gross Rosen concentration camp, which is one of the bigger of the camps. If you go to Israel, you go to Shem. The main camps are on the big memorial in the Tent of Remembrance, and Gross Rosen is one of them. It was an awful place. It's southwest Germany in Silesia. And there were sub-camps connected to Gross Rosen, and as many as 80,000 people were imprisoned there, and many of them died. As special prisoners, SOE officers were transferred to that building, to that camp, and nobody really knows, but on a Sunday morning, sometime between 28th of July and 4th of August, he was stripped naked and executed. And after that, other groups of agents were also murdered. The reason we know this is, of course, there are always survivors and witnesses, and these people were spoken to after the war by a lady called Vera Atkins. And I must tell you a little bit about her. There's stuff in my book about her and about Leo. I had the great honour of interviewing them before they died, and they told me firsthand of some of their experiences. Vera Atkins was really Vera Rosenberg. She used the name Atkins because she wanted to appear British. She experienced quite a bit of anti-Semitism when she was working in that section. She had been a British agent in Europe before the war, and that's why they took her into SOE. She also spoke fluent Romanian and Hungarian, but when I met her, she was as posh could be. And she said to me, "No film, no photographs. You're not the only one we met." She was very feisty. She was nearly 90 when I met her. She was a remarkable lady. She, after the war, because she knew all the agents, Buckmaster's assistant, she would take them to Tempsford, accompany them, search their pockets to see they didn't have bus tickets or player cigarettes, because if they were caught with them, it was a death sentence. She also managed getting their continental clothing, which they wore, and these were mostly made by Jewish tailors at the Natural History Museum, the special room no one knows about. These tailors worked and made these, or fitted them clothes which they bought from Jewish refugees in Britain because they had to wear locally made clothes. They couldn't wear something from Burton's or wherever it was. You bought your clothes in those days. And she did all of that, and after the war she did something quite remarkable. She got herself a British Women's Army uniform. She knew a lot of people in the intelligence units. She went to Germany. She went round all the prisons and she interviewed all the Nazi war criminals, showed them photographs, demanded they tell her, did she recognise this person? These were the missing agents. And they would say, oh yes, she was at my camp. She was gassed. And even give the name. And that's how she found out what happened to all the missing agents. including the two Jewish agents, women Jewish agents who were murdered, three actually, one of them was Polish. And for this she was given an MBE after the war, and the French gave her the Legion d'Honneur for doing this work. Sorry, I get a bit emotional. Okay. In 2011, they discovered documents at the Gross Rosen archive. Now, people think history's all over and we've got all the stuff that we need to know about. Not really. There are archives still being found, and the archives in Germany are so huge, most of them haven't even been looked at. And of course, you've got to have German language, and scholars are still studying this stuff. So in 2011, not that long ago, they discovered the Rawich prison documentation, and that confirmed everything about Leo being there. All the men and women who were there were named, and narrowed down the date of his death. He would have been 27 when he was executed, and his body was disposed of. Buckmaster later wrote he was an officer of exceptional value, very brave, our best radio operator. He was an officer with considerable military experience, set a good example. He was exemplary. We hold him in the highest esteem. Later, the French gave him the Croix de Guerre for his resistance work, posthumously. Lionel is commemorated on the memorial to the missing of Brookwood. You can go to Brookwood by train, I forget from which station, but it's a really good way to spend a nice day to see the military cemetery there, and his name is on the memorial to the missing. And outside Paris, there is an F-section memorial at Valençay, which Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, unveiled in the 1980s. And his name is inscribed there with all the others who died. And I was privileged to be able to put a memorial up to him at Lauriston Road Cemetery. We had a donor in America who is interested in putting up historic plaques to Jewish heroes. And I said, well, I've got a good idea for one, and he was over the moon. The United Synagogues own the cemetery in Lauriston Road, and they said yes immediately, so we had the headstone made. It's an empty grave, it's a cenotaph, but it tells you who he is. And I walk by there a lot. It was erected in August, and there's always people looking at it, because people are walking by and they see it. It's like black granite with gold letters. And I even stop and talk to them and say, do you like it? Do you know anything about this SOE? And they're quite interested. There's quite a lot of, and people are putting stones on the top of the headstone, which is a Jewish tradition, to say that you visited the grave. So the United Synagogue and Jerry Quinn in America are responsible for that. I organised it, but they the movement efforts. Okay, so let's look at some slides. That's Lionel himself, with the roll-armed corps, the chainmail fist badge on his beret. He was probably a tank driver, we don't know. That's Wanborough, where he went to do the basic training. When you went to join us at SOE, you signed the Official Secrets Act, and quite often the officer interviewing you put a revolver on the desk to show you that this was not kid stuff, this was going to be dangerous. And at Wanborough, you learnt the very basics, such as how to follow somebody without being seen, how to shake somebody off who was following you, how to use a dead letterbox to read messages, all this kind of stuff. And that was done at Wanborough. Yep. Then you had to do your parachute training. This is from the static balloon. That was the first few jumps. And then you got your wings, but then to get the wings to wear on your uniform, you had to do the next thing, which was jumping from an aircraft. Now, agents were usually taken in Halifax bombers that had a hole cut in the bottom and they slid out. Quite dangerous because you could hit your head on the rim. That's why they wore these big helmets and were told to put their hands up like this as they jumped out. Paratroopers jump from a side door, as you see in the movies. That's taken at Tatton Park, which is near Greenway Airport, which is where they did their training. Yep. Radio operation training was done at Fame Park in Oxfordshire. There's a typical suitcase radio. You've probably seen these in movies and in books, and that is Fame Park. These places were quite luxurious. You were looked after, good food, and so on. You were always in uniform, however, and they had huge grounds cut off with barbed wire and guarded, and you could walk and so on, but mostly it was tutorials, lessons, and practice. Yeah. This is the Club de Pine in Algeria, which was simply one of these houses disguised as a villa. So nobody inquired what it was, but it was an SOE hotel, basically. Let me say also at this point, some agents, when they done a bit of training, were deemed unsuitable, not right temperament, maybe a bit scared, and they could not be returned to their unit, RTU, because they knew too much. And there is a rumour, but it's never been proven, there is a novel written about this, based on interviews by the author, that there was a building in Scotland, in a very remote Scottish castle, called the Cooler. And you were sent there, very nice apparently, 5-star, but you weren't allowed out till the end of the war. And in the novel, this man and woman fall in love and try to escape and they get shot by the guards, but that's made up, he says at the end. But whether the Cooler existed, interesting. People are still looking for written evidence. That's the Club de Pine. This is HMS Trident. It's always important to mention the captain of the submarine who goes on a mission. You don't just give the name of the sub, you give the name of the captain. Why? This was very dangerous work. They went in very close to the enemy coast, shallow water. If they were spotted on the surface, there was no question of you surrender. They were shot out of the water. It was a death knell. So these guys used to do this several times a month. So you always mention the captain, the crews, very great guys. Yeah. Albury Hall, which is where he went for the S-phone training. You see they're lovely places. Some of these are still privately owned, some are conference centres. Paul McHugh, who I mentioned, does tours to these places. He's even a bigger anorak than I am, sorry Paul. It's very interesting, the atmosphere is quite strange. And let me just tell you a quick story. My wife and I were on holiday in Scotland, and I wanted to go to Arisaig, which was the combat unarmed training centre, Arisaig Castle for SOE agents. So I wanted to go and see it. So we drove towards it, it's on the map, a lonely country road, surrounded by pine trees, and suddenly on the road there was one of those red and white barriers. Nobody there, completely empty, and I got the feeling we were being watched. It was really that kind of feeling that someone was there. And I think Arisaig is still used by British intelligence for training. It's a very remote place and was used during the war. Anyway, yeah. Thamesford, that's an old photo. Most of the buildings are gone. There is a kind of factory there, but the barn is along that road you see on the bottom. And anyone can go. It's really quite moving. I would suggest if you're in that area, if you go to Woburn, Bletchley, anywhere around there, go to Thamesford to see the barn. Yeah. That's the Halifax 161 Squadron, special duties, very dangerous, and somebody jumping out. Yeah. This is Rowwich Prison, as it is today, the two colour photographs, and as it was back in the day, where Lionel spent some time and was probably quite badly treated with all the others he was with. Yeah. There is one, at least one other, is there not? There we go. That's the memorial in Morrison Road we put up in August. And yeah, that's the only local memorial too.
So beautiful. I saw it the other.
Sorry?
I saw it 2 days ago.
Yeah.
First time I was back in Hackney for a couple of years.
Oh, right.
So it wasn't there where I was last
Yeah,
year.
it's made quite an impact, I think. I do speak to you, honestly. I think that is the last one. Now, questions. Yeah, I'll take this one first.
There was a lot of suggestions that somebody was betraying Section F, not Bunkmaster, but somebody, possibly with the French resistance was betraying SOEs, flights,
Yes.
and things like
Well,
that.
let me stop you there because that was very common. Germans who lived in Alsace-Lorraine and spoke fluent French found it very easy for Gestapo agents to infiltrate the resistance. It happened all the time. But there is something darker. MI5 were very jealous of SOE work. They were rivals. And in the film Charlotte Gray, you see Kate Blanchett go and meet a guy in a ruin wearing a long coat right from Birmingham, made up. But this is symbolic. He said he had been in prison. MI5 said if he would go to France and do a bit of work for them, they'd give him a pardon. And that was what he was doing there. And people like him, because SOE did not care what the political colour of the French resistance were, they were just concerned with defeating the Nazis. But MI5 did, because they didn't want a communist government in France after the war. MI5 sometimes betrayed SOE agents. And that's why in 45 a lot of papers were burnt and a lot of files were weeded because they contained quite damaging stuff to basically the British intelligence community. But it's not in print. In other words, people talk about it a lot, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's kept quiet.
Yeah, just knowing we was going to come here, I just done a little bit of an internet search, and it said that just before the war you had about 300,000 Jews living in the UK, and it says on there that about 22% of them actually served in the armed forces, and they're compared with 12% of the. Is that true?
Yes, it's true.
Yeah. And so did the SOE recruit people from other parts, other parts of the empire, maybe
Oh yes.
Israel or something like that?
Yes. Well, funny you should mention Israel.
I mean, it wouldn't be Israel at the time, would they?
Yeah, from the British Mandate. SOE had training bases in the British Mandate, in Palestine, in Israel, and lots of Jews volunteered. They were gung-ho to have a crack at the Nazis. Also, many of them spoke European languages because they'd been refugees. There were 30 who were taken by the British into SOE, and they were trained at a place called Atrit, which is on the coast just north of Haifa. We twinned with Haifa, by the way, in Hackney. And that is still today the Israeli Frogman Commando training base. But it was SOE and SAS training base, and lots of Jews went for training there, Jews from Israel, trained there with the British. And the 7 of them, with 23 others, were parachuted into the Balkans over a period of time. 7 were killed, including 2 women, Hannah Senesh, who was a poet, and Aviva Reich, who was a kibbutznik. Their bodies were recovered because they were killed by the local fascist groups in Hungary and Slovakia. So after the war, in 51, when Israel was independent, they sent their missing in action unit, and they pleaded to have the bodies back, and they're now buried in the IDF cemetery in Jerusalem. And the 7 of them are, their headstones are arranged in the shape of a parachute, and it's called the Parachutist Memorial. Hannah's body is there, and Aviva. Enzo Serini, who was Italian, he was murdered at Dachau. They never found his remains. And others are on memorials of the missing at Brooklyn because they were British agents. People don't know much about this, but a lot of Israelis were in the SAS and the commandos in the Middle East, but they used false names in case they were captured. A lot of British Jews did that too. They used false names in case they were captured by the Nazis. As it happens, the Nazis did not ill-treat British Jewish prisoners, but only because the senior British officer in a prison camp would step forward and say, we have German prisoners in Britain. If you ill-treat our men, we don't distinguish, then your men are in danger of ill-treatment in Britain. And apparently Hitler was told about this, he went right up to the bunker, and he stopped all ill-treatment temporarily of British Jewish prisoners or Jewish prisoners who were captured from Israel. The Israelis are very proud of that name for Special Forces, which is why Britain's Special Forces have strong links with the Israeli Special Forces to this day. And Paul McHugh is putting up memorial plaques. He's done his homework, he's gone to Israel, he's not Jewish, he's just fascinated by all this. And there's a memorial in English, Hebrew and Arabic at Athlete, and they've got one in the Haifa Harbour, and there's also another one, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Haifa, Stella Maris on the top of Mount Carmel, this beautiful monastery with a lighthouse. Napoleon was there, he tried to take it. The British had a secret training base up there, and there is a plaque there remembering that. Just another backstory. One of the greatest commanders in the SAS was a man called Anders Larsen, Danish aristocrat. He's the only SAS man to win the Victoria Cross, killed in Italy. He trained a lot of Jewish fighting men at Athlete, and his memory is well remembered in Israel. There's this close link between the Danish forces and the Israelis.
Yeah, it's interesting to that period of time. Well, a lot of Jewish people think great English society had changed, and I could have talked about the original there, because of Russian traditional and we had to change the name from originally Bernstein to Bernstein. Everybody was changing the name to English names. Why is that?
Well, people did it before the war.
Because they want Jewish feeling at the time.
Yes, but also they wanted to integrate. They wanted to take English type names. But when it came to the war, many men and women actually did that and were ordered to do it, particularly the German refugees who served in the British forces. Hundreds of them.
Right.
And there's a whole commando unit, 3 Troop 10 commando, all German Jews who went in over on D-Day, took off the spear, took prisoners, questioned them, and got Germans to surrender. It's a whole story. Read the book by Leah Garrett, number 3 Troop 10 commando of the Jewish forces.
And another question was, what I noticed about the radio equipment was that it looked incredibly heavy.
It was very heavy.
Incredibly. But then you say later that they were kind of advanced.
Yeah, they
in their
take
technology.
it in small package.
That's really fascinating
Yes.
as well. Thank you very much.
Lady.
Hi, sorry. You've got the time to answer 2 questions, but I'll make them very quick. How accurate do you, if you are aware of the Sword of Honour trilogy by Evelyn Waugh, which relates to his own experiences and the early days of recruitment into SOE? I mean, obviously it's heavily satirised and very much from a political perspective, but how accurate do you think that is?
I've read it many years ago. It's all true.
Yeah.
I don't think Evelyn Waugh would have lied because he was a literary man. Maybe prone to exaggeration, like all writers, perhaps, I don't know. But yes, he was, I think what he said is historically been accepted, and some of his stuff has been incorporated in the history books. The official history of this SOE was written by a man called Michael Foot, nothing to do with a politician, and very, very detailed, but even he had to, he was self-censoring, because there was a lot of stuff he couldn't write about.
Yeah, so I think Evelyn Waugh does hint at the involvement of MI5 when you see the Balkans. Yeah. Sorry, that was the one. And if you do have time, it's really interesting about the history of the British, historic home, country house, and SOE. Are there any connections to the National Trust?
Well, if any of those buildings are National Trust or were at the time, then they would know about it. If they've got an archivist, they should know probably which buildings were used and what happened. And some of them, the one at East Anglia University, I forget the name of the place, there's a big country home there, now part of the university, and it's a hotel, I stayed there. There is a big plaque inside which says this was one of the SOE training schools in World War II. So it's very brief. Some of them do put them.
One more question.
Yeah, go on.
Did the SOE work in collaboration with the American OSS?
Yes.
And was there any Jewish agents in here?
Oh, absolutely. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Service, was the American version of SOE and later became the CIA. And they did the same thing. They would drop on a different aerodrome in Lincolnshire, drop their agents into Europe. They had their own agenda. but they worked very closely, and the heads of the two groups knew each other. And there was a programme on TV when I was a boy called OSS, black and white, and that was their story. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm fascinated because my father
No, just-
used to have a...
Sorry,
I'll tell you.
I don't know if this is of any interest to you. My husband worked in Queen Anne's Gate in the Attorney General's office in the 1990s. And there was a sort of myth that the SOE had a operation there, and that somebody had gone from there, been parachuted into France, and they'd been caught because they had a theatre ticket.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So I'm just thinking, I always thought, oh,
This is
sounds
what the
religious,
Atkins
but
did.
then you said
Yes,
about
yes,
the
yes,
Atkins,
absolutely. You had it because it's something silly like that, or a pack of players, or a bus ticket. So she would go through with their pockets. She also looked after them when they were on leave. SOE owned flats in Baker Street, and block of flats, and that's where they could stay when they were on leave. And she would make sure that they got all everything they needed, travel passes to see their parents if they were in Britain. Yeah, that was one of her jobs.
What is my father had incredible records when I was very young. What was amazing was the training they had, even though he was conscripted, because he was just an ordinary guy, but obviously he wanted to join the war. But the preparation they did for assembling guns, he had notebooks, all of it. And it was like extraordinary education they got before they actually went to war.
That was another thing
Phenomenal.
about SOE training. One of the buildings they went to, one of the schools, was just to hot on weapons. They had to know all the German weapons because they had to fire them.
It was just an
They
ordinary.
had to take them apart, and they had to know about German grenades and British grenades. The whole thing. It was a whole course. And then prison explosives. Because some of the agents were going to carry out espionage. You had to know where to put your charges on a bridge, on a railway line. If you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, you see it's not so simple. You have to lodge it in a certain place. All of that was taught in the Explosive Centre, which was one of the STS. Okay, you're all talked out. Thank you for listening. Don't clap, buy my book. If you do buy the book, I have updated, that's the second update. I've got, for the SOE section, we found about maybe 13 new names. And that's true of most of the chapters in this book. I'll leave some of my cards here. If you buy the book, email me, and I will send you by email the update pages so you can keep it together, and then you will have the very latest. Because I'm changing that every month. There's something going on. I can tell you a story right now. I won't. But, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.